we tend to relate to members of our sex and of different sexes in different ways. The society creates that gender, and animals do that too. Animals, dolphins often move around in very sex segregated pods, and there's nothing unnatural about that. But at the same time, they're not restricted by their sexuality.
Welcome to Closer to Truth. I'm speaking with evolutionary biologist Nathan Lents about his intriguing and challenging, yes, challenging new book, The Sexual Evolution: How 500 Million Years of Sex, Gender, and Mating Shape Modern Relationships. Nathan's thesis is that many of our supposedly modern and controversial ideas about human sexuality and gender, especially the diverse expressions, are in fact deeply rooted in our animal ancestors. Welcome, Nathan. It's great to see you again. Do I have your thesis right?
Yeah, I think you summarized it pretty well.
Okay, great. Well, you're going to do better than I. So please describe the intellectual arc of the position you take, how you position the book, and the argument that you give.
Well, generally, I want to say that the book is about animals, but it's as a way of understanding ourselves. And I think that there's a lot of uncertainty right now, a lot of upheaval with sexual diversity, gender diversity, diversity with respect to relationships, marriage rates, divorce rates. A lot of the things that bring us together when it comes to coupling and mating have been thrown into controversy. And it's began with the sexual revolution of the 1960s. But I think what's going on right now really makes that pale in comparison. Young people are really reimagining their approach to sex and relationships. But what I argue in the book is actually this is a return to a more flexible, diverse, and expansive relationship with gender and sexuality that our ancestors once had. And I mean ancestors in terms of our very deep past. If we look at other primates, other mammals, we can see how they explore gender and sexuality, and how sex is a component of their social relationships. So our deep ancestors, I think, had a more expansive relationship with sex, but I also think our more recent ancestors. So if we look at foraging societies today, and what we know of the few that are left and those that we made contact with before they disappeared, foraging societies also approach gender and sexuality in much more creative ways than modern society does. So I think what's happened is we've contracted the way that sex and gender exist in our society over the course of industrialization. And even before that, in the earliest beginnings of civilization and settled life. Basically, it became like a steamroller culturally, sort of repressing a lot of the diverse ways that we engaged our sexuality into a much more of a one size supposedly fits all way of, heteronormative coupling and marriage, sort of the Victorian ideals of lifelong exclusive marriage. And we've been made to think that this is the natural way that we are. And what I argue in the book is actually we're built for all kinds of different relationships and different expressions of our sexuality, and our gender expression even has undergone a lot of exploration over the years. And if we look to our animal cousins, we see a lot of parallels with the human experience of sexuality. And so I'm not going to argue that we throw everything out the window and there's no place for sort of the traditional view of marriage. I just mean that we shouldn't be frightened of different ways of exploring gender and sexuality either, and that there's room for lots of different forms of this expression, and whatever sort of finds success in the social environment is okay. And I think that really there shouldn't be anything in here that scares anyone, but it should hopefully open some minds to the possibility that gender and sexuality are really supposed to be diverse and are supposed to be creative. It's supposed to be something that we engage with in a much more expansive way than this sort of one size fits all that modern society has been preaching for a few centuries.
One of the challenges in the book, when you use animal models from the past, either our most recent past with primates or going back further, indeed, the subtitle 500 million years, is what you select and what you don't, because you make a point in the book that issues of pedophilia, rape, violence, the alpha male killing the progeny of the previous alpha male are not something that you support. So, in a sense, you're picking some things from the animal model and eliminating others.
Well, I would put it a different way. I'm not suggesting that we look to the animal world for moral lessons, and I'm not saying that there's anything. Um, uh, there, I don't use animals as my moral reasoning. What I do use animals and exploring animals to answer is what is natural versus what is not. And I am reacting against the idea that there's a natural way that humans are supposed to approach this versus an unnatural way. Because let's be clear, let's put a fine point on this. The queer population in all of its many manifestations has been told that there's something wrong with them, that they're unnatural, and that their lifestyle is aberrant, and their approach to gender is aberrant and disordered. These are the kind of words that have been thrown around for a long time. And so by selecting stories and examples from other animals, my point is not that we should be doing what these animals do or that this proves that this is fine. All I'm trying to say is that there's nothing unnatural with the creative use of gender expression and gender identity. The idea that we could conceptualize our own relationship with our sexed bodies, that is natural. That is, we would be unusual for us to not have a creative approach to some of these matters when we do see it in all of the other species. So I of course, urge caution towards anyone who would use animals in their moral reasoning about how humans should behave. There's lots of things that animals do that I think we do very well to prohibit and to discourage and to punish. And as you mentioned, most animals don't have a particular taboo around age of sexual maturity and things like that. Of course, I'm not advocating that we emulate anything like that. And in fact, I go out of my way to make sure I point out those things along the way. But what I am saying is that the idea that a certain individual, consenting adults, living their lives, living their sexuality in the way that makes sense to them, that feels right to them, that in and of itself cannot possibly be unnatural when we do see such obvious parallels to other species. Not to mention a fairly global, universal themes that come out here. We've seen that the way that humans approach sexuality in all these foraging societies, it has a lot of differences, but a lot of commonality as well. And so to say that, for example, same-sex coupling is unnatural, well, then you'd have to be telling foraging societies all around the world that what they're doing is unnatural. And I don't think anyone could really defend that position. So my point is not to use animals as the models of how we should live our lives, but rather animals to educate why we are the way that we are. And so to answer, questions about what is right and wrong, that's really not so much the area of biology. I don't think biology really is in the business of moral reasoning. But what biology can provide to this argument is an understanding of the natural history of sexuality. Humans didn't just fall on the planet. We come from a very, very long history of sex. I mean, each of us got here because two people had sex, and those people got here because two people had sex. And you keep going on backwards in time, you'll see we are sexual people doing sexual things. We are sexual species. And so to understand the fullness of our relationship with sex, I think we're missing a big part of the story if we don't consider its long history and what sex does for us, why we seek it.
Nathan, I'm hearing two different kinds of axes, and I want to see how they articulate. One is a natural, unnatural axis, and the other is a moral, immoral axis. And both are relevant to human behavior, of course, and both have some relationship to animal models that you articulate. So how do those two axes articulate?
That's a great question because I think my book really straddles the world of is versus ought. And I think, biology strives to describe the world as it is, as accurately as possible. It doesn't necessarily have within its realm the prerogative to say how the world should be, how the world ought to be. And so biology really isn't in the business of making moral statements. But what I think what is key to this is that to make the best moral statements, we need to know, we need to have accurate information about how the world is, about how we are. And so biology is charged with describing how humans are, how the natural world exists, how it got this way. And I think that is an important part for making the best moral statements. So while biologists aren't in the business of making moral statements, the reality that we're describing is and should be a part of those moral statements. And so I don't think that we look for animals, we look to animals as our moral guides, but in understanding how animals live, how humans have always lived, that should be part of why and how we reach those moral statements. So that's why I think there really is two separate things to consider. How the world is and how the world should be. But I don't think that biology has had enough to say. I think that biology deserves a bigger seat at the table when it comes to moral reasoning about gender and sex and sexuality, because for far too long, people have said that certain sexualities and gender expressions are wrong, are morally impermissible, and they use as part of that reasoning the idea that they're unnatural. And that's where biology has every right to push back and say, no, there's nothing unnatural about diverse gender expression. There's nothing unnatural about diverse sexualities. And in fact, they're found all throughout the natural world, including and especially in humans and our recent ancestors. And you might still be able to argue that some of this is morally wrong. But what you can't do is say it's unnatural. That's where biologists have to nudge people back in their lane by defending the notions of how the natural world really is.
Tell me the story about the changing cover design of your book, the two images. What was it originally, and why did it change?
Well, the first image that we came up with was the image of two male lions in affectionate contact. And I really liked that image because it, first of all, it showed that sex and sexuality is not just about what goes on in the bedroom and particular sexual intercourse, but it's about pairing up. It's about coupling. It's about mating. It's about having a relationship that really is different than all of our other relationships. Our sexual partners do hold a sort of special place in our lives. And seeing these two lions in affectionate contact, I think, was a nice way to talk about diverse sexualities.
Good. And then the new.
And then the new cover was actually first designed by my publisher in the UK, and what it showed was a single chimpanzee that was with the genital areas blurred out. And so I kind of like that too, because what it talked about is it confronts taboo. It confronts the idea that sex is something that we kind of have to obscure and we can't fully talk about. There's certain images and languages really can't make it into the book because otherwise it might be labeled for adults only, that kind of thing. So it kind of plays around with this idea that we are all sexual creatures, but yet only part of that is really okay to talk about in polite company. So I like that cover, and we decided to use that here in the US as well. I hope that the lion cover gets some use as well, because that's another aspect of the book that I enjoy.
Good. Thanks, Nathan, very much. Let me give a more extensive bio at this point.
Sure.
Nathan Lents is professor of biology at John Jay College at CUNY. His research lab studies the recent evolution of the human genome to help understand the genetic underpinnings of human uniqueness. His popular science books include Not So Different, Finding Human Nature in Animals, and Human Errors, a panorama of our glitches from pointless bones to broken genes. Nathan, let's start by getting all our sexual terms right. No slang here, or we'd have hundreds. So let's go into each of the terms that are used and understand what they mean and how they articulate together. So the first is the most obvious, critical to the book, the difference between sex and gender.
So sex is refers to the body. It is a physical property of living things, and it is imprinted on most of the cells throughout the body. Whereas gender is a psychosocial phenomenon. So it's the way that we live our sex, and that refers to a gender identity, which is an inner feeling about sex, and then a gender expression would be outward, how we interact with others.
In the book, you talk about gender in the animal kingdom, which took me back a little bit. Sex is obvious, male and female, the various differences and variations that occur, but sex is clear in animals. But gender is a little challenging, but you explain it quite well.
Well, I argue that gender in animals has to do with how they engage their maleness and how they engage their femaleness. So it has to do with reproductive behaviors, reproductive strategies, but even the way that their sexed body can vary within sexes. So there's not always just one type of male or one type of female in a species. And so I argue that gender is a way to understand variability and variation within the sexes.
And by understanding the animal model, then you can infer what that may mean, or at least part of it, what it may mean for humans.
Yes, I think when we understand that other animals explore their sexed identity and their gendered behaviors, it makes it more clear that humans would do the same. I think that when we look at other species, including our close relatives, and we see that males and females explore their sexuality in various ways and their gendered behaviors, it makes it less odd that humans would do the same. In fact, I would argue that it would be odd if we didn't have variation in our sex and gender.
Okay, let's now go to the primary terms or the categories that are used as we talk about sex in humans. In one, we have heterosexual, straight, and then the somewhat new term, cisgender.
Mhm.
And on the other side, we have homosexual, gay, lesbian. So, in each of these categories, define how each of these terms are used. Are they completely synonymous? Obviously, gay and lesbian is not. And in particular, the emergence of the term cisgender.
So cisgender, that term came about as a way to refer to people who are not transgender. And transgender is a word that we don't really apply towards animals. We really just talk about humans as individuals whose gender expression and identity doesn't match with their biological sex at birth, or and you can refer to anatomical sex. Is that if there's any kind of discordance there with expectations, we use the term transgender. And cisgender is just meant to show that there isn't that discordance. So we don't really talk about cisgender or transgender with animals because we don't really have access to what they're experiencing subjectively in their internal environment anyway. But the idea that males and females behave in ways that are different than the majority of their sex, that we do see in animals. And that's why I use the word gender. When you're talking about sexuality, it's different again. So you have heterosexuality, homosexuality, and bisexuality. Those three are the oldest terms that we have to refer to sexuality in humans. But what we found is that the borders between these get grayer and grayer and fuzzier as time goes on and we explore sexuality more. And that's led a lot of people to think that these hard labels and with strict criteria might not be the best way to capture sexuality because not everybody fits into a bucket. And so this is where the idea of sexual fluidity has come, where you can change over time and even change on situation. And so there's some people who find themselves more attracted to individuals and their connection to individuals, really regardless of their sex or gender. So sometimes they're called pansexual or demisexual. And there's an increasing, I think, appreciation for the fact that sometimes the categories and labels really get in the way. They don't help us communicate about sexuality and sexual relationships. They actually inhibit our ability. And actually, I would like to use the term heterosexual as the one that's the most problematic. Because if you consider a heterosexual as someone who's attracted to members of the opposite sex, well, lots of people in lots of other categories and labels are also attracted to members of the opposite sex. So you would come back to heterosexuality and say, well, what makes it unique is that you're not attracted to anything else. And that becomes the only label that's defined by its aversions rather than its attractions. And so it doesn't fit with the labels as well. So really, none of these labels really capture the experience as much. And I think that what we see with other animals, how their sexuality isn't strictly defined and this hard property that doesn't change. I think it's more in line with what we're now seeing in humans.
So the primary term you said is heterosexual, homosexual, bisexual were the original, but that has shown to be a weak to be a hard determinant, that there are other categories. The terms non-binary, gender non-binary, gender fluidity, agender, are those synonymous, or are there subtle differences among
No,
them?
there's going to be subtle differences there. So, and again, if sexuality and gender expression are different again, and I argue that there's some relatedness between sexuality and gender expression, but they're not the same thing. I would put them on two sides of a spectrum, a multidimensional spectrum. And so, gender expression, people who are non-binary, what all that means is that they have some masculinity and some femininity that gets expressed in different times and places and ways. And they don't feel themselves restricted by masculinity, and they engage femininity as well as masculinity, sometimes even at the same time. So you'll see individuals who might outwardly dress in very feminine ways, but their body and they maintain their body with beards and everything else in more masculine ways, and they just don't feel restricted by any of the categories of masculine and femininity. That's really where non-binary comes from. The equivalent when it comes to sexuality would be a pansexual, someone who is attracted to maleness, femaleness, and that inclusive of transgender masculinity and transgender femininity. That would be a pansexual, where they're just really not restricted by gender expression at all in terms of their attraction. Um, and attraction and expression don't always go together, but they often do. And this really has given rise to the movement that we call no labels, where people are just doing away with the labels and categories altogether and just saying, hey, I'm me. And I have a relationship with this person, and it's not defined by our gender or our anatomy or anything like that. We just have this connection that we're going to explore.
So in gender, again, the terms non-binary, fluidity, or agender, within a description of gender, are those three terms similar, or are there differences within?
There's differences. So non-binary gender expression, as I said, would engage both masculinity and femininity, whereas agender would tend to eschew expressions that are too feminine or too masculine either way, and tend towards a more neutral gender expression, because not everything we do or wear or put on ourselves is gendered, and so they would tend to leave the extremes, whereas a lot of non-binary individuals go towards the extremes.
Uh,
But once again, these there aren't hard boundaries among these, and people can slip in and out of them from day to day, even, but especially over the course of a lifetime.
sure, and that's why to understand these terms gives us a better sense of that. Um,
Yes.
and the term gender fluidity, how would you distinguish that from non-binary?
Well, gender fluidity has to do more with changing over time.
Uh-huh.
And so, you might go through periods of your life where you are more engaged in your masculine side, and other periods of your life where you're more engaged in the feminine side. Whereas non-binary tends to be at the same time, less boxed in as masculine or feminine, or rather kind of both at the same time. That's how that would be the subtle distinction there.
Okay, good. And then the terms you used, pansexual and demisexual,
Mhm.
those are applied to sex as opposed to gender, but do
Right.
they, or is that sort of a parallelism?
There are some parallels between gender identity and expression and attraction. So, for example, a pansexual might be attracted to all kinds of gender expressions. Or actually, a better way that I would say it is not restricted by any gender expressions. Because sometimes people get the idea of, well, if someone's pansexual, they're attracted to everyone. It doesn't mean they're attracted to everyone. It just means that their attractions aren't really bound by masculinity or femininity or cisgender and transgender even. And that's how it's different than bisexual, for example.
Mm.
Bisexual tends to mostly identify when you're attracted to cisgender male and female, whereas pansexual, cisgender, transgender, non-binary, gender fluid, none of it matters. But it doesn't mean you're attracted to everyone. And in fact, pansexuals tend to be those who are more attracted to a personality, to intelligence, to emotional availability and maturity. Things like that tend to matter more to pansexuals than things like what anatomy they have. And this doesn't mean that everyone needs to sign up for what they are attracted to and find the label that best fits them, because a lot of times the more labels we create, the more we realize that the labels can often get in the way. But then there's plenty of other individuals whose attractions are very stable, and so they would find would be attracted to a certain label.
A difference between pansexual and demisexual?
So a pansexual is just simply not being restricted by the gender of someone
Right.
in terms of attraction, whereas demisexual specifically refers to being attracted to a person based on emotion, emotional connection, intelligence, so features other than gender, if that makes sense. So pansexual is unrestricted. Demisexual is more that the physicality isn't really a big part of it.
Okay.
And yeah, so and of course an individual can be in both of those categories, of course. And in fact, I would say there's a lot of overlap there.
And the what sounds like a funny word, metrosexual, actually is a term of gender, not sex. Is that right?
Yeah, the term metrosexual came about to describe basically straight men who started behaving like gay men in terms of their personal grooming and attention to some of those things. So I think it was a tongue-in-cheek.
Right.
And I remember when this came out in the early 2000s, it was a way of saying, well, geez, it used to be gay men that really took care of themselves. Now straight men are doing it too. And this is confusing everyone. We used to be able to tell who was gay just because they, were well groomed. And I think, to be honest, the silliness of this really goes to the silliness of some of our gendered attitudes in the first place. The idea that grooming yourself well had anything to do with your attraction. That never made any sense, right? And a lot of things that we establish as feminine traits or masculine traits really has nothing to do with sex or sexuality or attraction. They're just these cultural trappings of masculinity and femininity. And they're not always bad. There's, one thing that's happened, we talk about toxic masculinity that has come about, and some people react and say, masculinity isn't toxic. It was like, of course it's not. Nobody has said that all masculinity is toxic, but that there is a certain flavor of masculinity that can be toxic. And that's all that was meant. And so I think what we're trying to do now, what I think gender theorists are trying to do now, is dissect all of this stuff in order to liberate all people. And the liberation of gender and sexuality is good for everyone. Include if you're a regular cisgender heterosexual man, you're boxed in as well by some of these conventions. And so, I mean, wouldn't you like to be able to enjoy the ballet without people thinking you're gay for doing that? I mean, a lot of these things really, they don't do any good for anyone to have these hard categories and expectations that are associated with them.
Good. The term intersexual is more of a biological term in terms of the of an individual body that would have literal anatomical features of both male and female, hermaphroditic types of expressions.
That's right. So the term intersex came about as an alternative to a term called DSD, which is disorders of sexual development. And this term came about when individuals are born with somewhat ambiguous sexual anatomy. And so they call these disorders of sexual development. But it's important to remember that the vast majority of those individuals, there's nothing really wrong with them medically. They might be sterile, and there's not necessarily anything that needs to be corrected. And so the intersex community established itself to assert the reality that not everyone wants to be fixed or changed to be more palatable to other people. They might be just fine with the body that they have. That's number one. And number two, a lot of times the interventions that were done did more harm than good. So not everybody advocates for any kind of surgical or other, hormonal intervention, at least during childhood, to let individuals grow up a little bit and let them decide how, if any, intervention that they might want. So the intersex community is sort of exists on the sexual side in between the two genders, or with aspects of both, I should say sexes, of aspects of both sexes, and the way that they navigate that. And it's very much open to individual preference and choices on that.
And then the terms non-sexual or asexual is also given expression in terms of the, shall we say, legitimacy of people who are not engaged sexually as most are.
That's right. Asexuality has been acknowledged for a very long time. And in fact, the original Kinsey reports in the 1950s acknowledged that some people just don't have a lot of sexual attraction, and we call them asexual. There's also something called aromantic, which means that you're not interested in intimacy, emotional intimacy. So you might be able to have sex, but you're not really interested in forming a dyad, dating and relationships. So asexual and aromantic, those don't always coincide. In fact, some people who are asexual but really do thrive in relationships. And just because you're asexual doesn't mean you don't ever have sex. It just means it's not a particularly strong drive for you.
Okay.
And this was an important, I think, realization too, because a lot of people with low sex drive, again, were told that there was something wrong with them. And that might not be true. That might just be part of the normal variation that we expect to see in sexuality.
Good. That's why exploring these terms are really very helpful. One final term is an unusual one, and you use it, and it's the word queer. Now,
Hmm.
to show you my age, queer used to be a pejorative, a term
Hmm.
of derision. That's much less so today, perhaps not at all so today. In fact, you use the word queer in your book, in your book's dedication, which is a very uplifting one.
Hmm. That's right. The word queer really was reclaimed by the community because, as you say, it was a pejorative, and like many other minorities that suffered the harshness of these pejorative labels, we've reclaimed it as something that's positive. And what queer is it's a nice 5 letters that captures everybody. Everybody who's not just the standard cisgender heterosexual, and with an active sex drive and that kind of thing. So if you're not anything that's the standard, and we do have to admit that obviously heterosexuality is more common than homosexuality, and cisgender is more common than transgender. So what you end up with are sexual minorities of various kinds, but they can find solidarity together despite their differences under the label queer. And a lot of people prefer queer rather than LGBTQIA and the other labels, and people have, again, you turn that into pejorative. They call us the alphabet mafia.
Right.
And so queer was a way to recapture a formerly pejorative word, but also be as inclusive as possible. The asexuals and the intersex individuals all are considered and welcomed as part of the queer community.
Yeah, your dedication really is moving. I'll just read it. I dedicate this book to every queer person who has been told that they are unnatural. Not only are you natural, you are flawless and beautiful exactly as you are. That's quite a moving dedication.
Thank you. That's really the theme of the book, is to look around in nature and see all kinds of diversity and variability in all of these aspects, in sex, in gender, in relationships, attraction. What we see in other species when we really open our eyes is we see a whole lot of diversity. And each flavor of diversity can thrive. And sometimes you have an advantage just by being different. When the whole crowd is doing one thing, when someone is different, that in and of itself can be an advantage. So that's why I dedicated to the book to people who've been told that their difference is a problem. Their difference is only a problem for the rest of us if we choose to make it so. But if we're okay with our neighbors living however they want to live, as long as they're not hurting anyone, then we can celebrate those differences.
One diversity example, which was very profound to me when I knew this person, well, it is a trans woman in a lesbian relationship with another woman. Now,
Mhm.
when that pre-trans woman was a male, that male could have had a heterosexual, normal relationship with that same woman.
Mhm.
and but that's not what this person was able or wanted to do. So in theory, that would be the case, but in practice, because psychologically, it wasn't. It's a very fine and important distinction. And the trans woman who is now a male and this straight woman were very happy.
Right. Because if you think about it, their connection, their emotional connection, I mean, how much of it really depended on them being in bed together, right? I mean, Robert, you're married, right? So, sex is one small part of a much larger
Sure.
existence, right? The connection that you have with people, building a life with them. And in fact, I talk about in chapter 4 of the book, social monogamy versus sexual monogamy. Social monogamy is a very huge concept. It's who you share your life with, who you build your home with, who you raise your kids with, and sharing resources and territory is a key part of monogamy. But who you do and don't have sex with is a separate matter. And humans have really enjoined those two into this concept that we know of as marriage, but nowhere else in the animal kingdom do we see it that strictly defined. In fact, sexual monogamy is really rare out there in nature. And that's a good parallel. So if you have a couple where one member of their has realized that their gender expression and gender identity is not what it was or not what they thought it was 20 years ago, but they maintain the relationship. I mean, to me, that proves the point that sexuality is one thing, gender is another thing. They often go together, but they don't always go together. But they do. I always consider this like an XY plot where your gender identity and expression is on one axis and your sexuality is on another axis. And where you are is really determined by both aspects. It doesn't mean that they're connected. They are two different things, but they're part of one large reality, which is your sexual experience in the world. So I think uncoupling all of these concepts has really allowed people to be who they are, their authentic selves.
Good. And to conclude this way of thinking, you make a concluding statement in terms of your overarching view that you're comfortable concluding that 80% of women and 90% of men can be considered pretty straight,
Mhm.
with 10% of men and 20% of women, what you use a very nice term, is being something else. So all inclusive of the word queer.
Right. I think that's about right. With the idea being that we all can change a little bit over time. I think that solid majorities of both men and women are fairly straight. But how do you define someone being bisexual? Is it a one-time experience? Does that make them bisexual after a whole life of being heterosexual? I don't think so. I don't think anyone would say so. They were just experimenting. They were curious, right? Um, and at the other extreme, if you have someone who's almost exclusively homosexual, but under the right circumstances, would maybe have a sexual experience with someone with the opposite sex. Does that mean they're actually bisexual? Probably not. So the idea being that most individuals are pretty clear on one side or the other, with more people being on the heterosexual side. But as long as we're all free to explore that in ways that we want with other consenting adults, I don't see the reason why we have to be so married to these labels.
Great, Nathan. That's really really expresses the clarity of the book in terms of these terms. Nathan, what I'd like to do now is to go into the biology. You say, to quote you, the book was written very much in response to the current moment of social and sexual upheaval, and that the reason that you felt compelled to write the book was because of your irritation. I love the word irritation that biology is conspicuously absent from the public discussion. So, how so? And very briefly, how does that inform your book?
Yeah, I've always felt that we're hearing from a lot of different interest groups about sex and gender and sexuality. But where are all the biologists, and where's the appreciation that these are mostly a biological phenomena? So I think that biology has really two roles to play. First of all, in just understanding the natural history of sex and gender. Where did all this come from? At its earliest origins, and how did it take shape? Why do we have two gametes, egg and sperm? Like where did all this come from? And then the other thing that I think biology has to add is to show us that sex does a lot more than just create zygotes. Sex brings people together. It can bring communities together. It's the way that we really navigate the world. And a lot of relationships have a sexual component to them. And I don't necessarily mean that they're sexually active, but we tend to relate to members of our sex and of different sexes in different ways. The society creates that gender, and animals do that too. Animals, dolphins often move around in very sex segregated pods. And there's nothing unnatural about that. But at the same time, they're not restricted by their sexuality. The males tend to have sex with each other, and the females have sex with each other, and then they come together and do this. And they're not bothered by the conventions around that. So that's really what I'm talking about is biology should have a bigger seat at the table when it comes to discussing things, especially when some people take it upon themselves to call certain behaviors unnatural. That's where biologists, I think, have to have a seat at the table to remind people what is and what isn't unnatural.
A very fascinating part of the book is when you show how animals use sex for all different kinds of purposes, as you put it, bonding, social cohesion, alliance building, and you also say that that animals can use sex deceptively, competitively, and financially. Financially was an interesting word there, and they even have sex just for the fun of it.
That's right. We see animals have sex with each other for all kinds of ways that are in no way connected to creation of a new individual, and they do use it financially. Purchasing sexual access is something that goes back hundreds of millions of years, and in fact, there's even and when I say deceptively, I use several examples in the book, but just in general, there are animals that will allow sexual access by another individual, but they'll withhold their gametes. They won't give them sperm or egg, but they'll let them have sex with them. So they'll kind of cheat them out of the nuptial gift, whether it's food or some other resource. And so I think that it's a behavior that animals have long known they can use to their advantage over other individuals. And so that's why they can use it deceptively. And they do use it financially. Animals do purchase sexual access from each other. And that's why, it's kind of tongue in cheek that we call it the oldest profession. But animals have been acquiring things for themselves in this. In fact, even olive baboons will groom each other and pick off the little lice and other insects, and they expect a little something for it. It's like buying someone a drink at a bar. It's not that it's going to work every time, but the more often you do it, the more likely you are to get somewhere. And it also, I say a lot of these things tongue in cheek, but I also think it speaks to a deeper reality where um, sex is a way that that some animals use for quality control to really suss out what the individual is like, and do we want those genes mingled with ours in the next generation. It's part of the way that we assess someone, and I think that humans do the same thing. And that doesn't mean their prowess in the bedroom. That's not what I mean. But the way that you connect with someone in sexual ways really either builds a relationship or it makes you go your separate ways. Sometimes you're like, this wasn't right for me. And you can't even always put words on it. And I think that animals do the same thing. It's part of what brings them together.
Do you have any sense of the percentage of non-heterosexual activities throughout the animal kingdom? Just a very broad sense of the range of different animals. How many? What percentage would you say of the activities would be non-heterosexual?
It's very hard to say that just because of variation within species, but let me give you a couple examples. If you look at chimpanzees and bonobos, those are our
Yeah.
closest relatives. I like to use those as an example because they're quite different, but they're equally related to us. Chimpanzees are much more heterosexual than bonobos are, but they still do have sex with members of their same sex, and we could say maybe 10 to 20% of sexual intercourse might be something other than a standard heterosexual arrangement. If you look over at bonobos, it's the opposite. It's more like heterosexual activity, at least among females, is the minority of their sexual activity. In fact, the females have sex with each other much more often than they have sex with other males. Some people have estimated it at like 10 to 1 with same-sex sexual activity. And obviously that's not procreative, but it's doing something. They don't spend so much time on it if it were completely useless to them. And in fact, it's part of their hierarchy. If you look at another extreme, look at if we go a little bit further out and go to orangutans, we're separated from them a much longer period, about 12 million years of evolution. Well, orangutans are solitary. So they tend their only sexual congress is for the purpose of procreation, and it happens for just a couple of days a year during their fertile period. To me, these are the examples that really prove that sexuality is part of a social fabric, because really solitary non-social species have very little use for sex except procreation. But very social species tend to have a lot of sex for all kinds of reasons. So that's what I mean by it. It builds a social fabric.
Nathan, let me give you this challenge. As I'm sure you know, the evolutionary biologist Richard Dawkins
Mhm,
says that sex is a simple binary based
mhm.
on the gametes, and that people can only be male or female. And in fact, I read that Dawkins left the atheist foundation called Freedom from Religion Foundation after it pulled the article, took it down, unpublished it, Biology is Not Bigotry, which argued that gender is based on biology, and that after it received a backlash from the pro-trans community.
Yeah, well, that's a larger story. The it's important that Jerry Coyne's article was in response to another article that the Freedom from Religious Foundation had published, and they didn't edit or mess around with his article very much. And there's a lot in his article that's not just about maleness and femaleness, and he uses some I think very spurious statistics to justify suspicion of trans people in bathrooms and as rape counselors and things like this. And to me, it was an unseemly essay. Now, whether or not it was the right thing to do to remove that, I'm not so sure. But a lot of people have come to Jerry Coyne's defense simply because they did sort of unpublish his article. And whether or not that was appropriate, I'm not going to get into that too much, other than to say I don't agree with everything that Jerry Coyne has said on this matter. I also think the idea of reducing sex simply as a matter of eggs and sperm really reduces what sex really is. It is true that among humans, everyone will make either eggs or sperm, not both. But in lots of other animals, that's not true, by the way. So there are more than two sexes in the animal kingdom. Hermaphrodites are a very important part of many species, so that they can make both. So there's at a minimum there's three sexes, right? But in humans, you can't make just egg or just sperm. But why would I say that that's not what it all comes down to? Is because that centers the gonads over the entire rest of your body. But if you look at the way that sex imprints all the other features of your body, you do not get a simple binary, right? You get what we call a bimodal distribution. And these other measures are much more important than whether you make eggs or sperm. So, for example, cardiovascular health, your basal metabolic rate, upper body strength, even some anatomical regions of your brain. These show sex differences. We call those sex differences dimorphism. So, but, it's important to remember that these are a spectrum, and they're bimodal, where most people fall in one of the two humps. But there are people in the middle, and we can't just simply ignore them and discard them. All right. And we can't just go to say, oh, okay, well, which gamete do you make? That's how we call you a male or female. When many of the other measures, they might fall much more into the other category. And we are all mosaics. So you might have a typically male body shape, but you might have a typically female basal metabolic rate. Or maybe the size of your corpus callosum matches well with other males, but the size of your amygdala is more in line with what we see in females. So we are all a mosaic of these sexually dimorphic features all throughout our body. And to say that the gametes and the gonads are the only thing that make you male or female, come on. I mean, I don't know anything about your gametes or your gonads, but the rest of your body is visible to me, and I interact with it. When you go to your doctor and they look at what kind of diseases you're liable to get, right? It doesn't have anything to do with what's in between your legs. It has to do with how your heart works and how your brain works and your hormone levels. None of these things are strictly dependent on gametes. So I think sex goes much beyond that. And I think that everyone knows that too.
Fascinating, Nathan. I think these are important points to consider. So now, Nathan, you argue that nature has made a lot of space for diverse genders and sexual behaviors, and you ask why. Because when it comes to evolution, I'm quoting you, diversity wins, and that's for sure. So it is no doubt that diversity is indeed part of the evolutionary story. But I would argue that it's just the first part of the
Mhm.
evolutionary story, diversity. The second and arguably third parts, to be simple, are fitness and procreation.
Mhm.
So, an obvious question in terms of your book then is why would evolution select for non-reproductive homosexuality? Could it be, just to throw out some ideas, could it be part of enhancing group fitness for group selection,
Mhm.
which itself is a controversial part of evolutionary theory? Is group selection legitimate? Or could it be a so-called spandrel, a non-fitness rider on some other fitness enhancing traits? So is some of this thinking, because I think you have to address the question of how could evolution select for non-reproductive sexual activity?
Well, you've just given two easy ways that we could think about the selective benefits of same-sex sexuality. So just right there, if it promotes social cohesion, for example. But I want to challenge you to think to undo some of the categorical thinking that you have, because if you think of same sexuality as only same sexuality, as never having any sexual interest in the opposite sex, then you have a tougher time. You have more work to do to explain it. But my point all along is that it isn't usually that hardcore. So, for example, the big shocking revelation in the late '90s about albatrosses, these birds that form female dyads with really high numbers. Um, Nobody recognized that most of the bird pairings of these albatrosses were female because males and females look identical. They are not dimorphic. You cannot tell. Even a good ornithologist, they don't have external sexual anatomy. It's almost impossible to tell who's a male and who's a male and who's a female. And so um, the fact that these females were pairing up, the females themselves were still getting pregnant and laying eggs, right? So females don't impregnate other females, so they're not pairing with each other at the exclusion of ever having sex with a male. They go off and get pregnant and then come back. So they've decoupled the sexual congress with who they pair up with, and they're at a benefit when they do so. And so, if you think of homosexuals as never ever having sex with members of the opposite sex, then you have a little bit more work to do. But there are even good models to understand that. So, for example, kin selection is one of the models that's been used to understand why same-sex sexuality has persisted among humans, with the idea being that if you have a fairly large litter size, we'll say, if everybody is pumping out as many children as possible, that's not necessarily a good route for success because they all compete with each other. But if some members of each litter are involved in the success of that litter in competing against other litters, and remember, they share genes. But close relatives are going to share genes. So if the same genes in some individuals promote that social cohesion and solidarity within the group, then it doesn't matter that they themselves might not be reproducing. The family that they're part of might have an advantage. So that's just one example. But if you look at lion prides, not all of them, but a great number of lion prides are headed by an alpha and a beta, and sometimes even a gamma male. So you have multiple males that are leading this pride. They're all allowed to reproduce with the females under a certain hierarchy, but they also have sex with each other to build trust, to build the alliance, and to promote social bonding, because mammals bond with each other when they have sex. There's hormones that are released, vasopressin and oxytocin, that make you feel connected. And so lions have the ability to connect together and work better as an alliance by having sex with each other. But that doesn't mean they don't also have sex with females in order to pass on the genes. And so the paternity of a lion alliance is based on their dominance, but you're still better off having sex with other males than if you're trying to always go it alone. Do you see what I'm saying? So you don't want to put sex with the opposite sex and sex with the same sex as if they're in competition. Both can happen.
You tell an interesting story in the book of a conversation you had with a distinguished biologist. You don't give the name for obvious reasons. And his, I assume it was a he, argument was that homosexuality will become more and more extinct counterintuitively because homosexuality is now more and more accepted. And the argument goes, and it has to do with the subject we're talking about, that because homosexuality is now accepted, homosexuals do not have to have sham marriages in which they are married, so they're acceptable to society and keep their homosexuality secret, and therefore can procreate with their genes or whatever it is that engender homosexuality. So this is an argument that you refute. How do you do that?
Well, it's based on a lot of misconceptions. First of all, the idea that homosexuality is a simple genetic trait. We know that that's not true. It's a very complex trait, and you can't just breed it out of the population because you can't isolate it as a variable. Your sexuality is determined by all kinds of genetic elements across all your chromosomes. There's really no way to breed it out of the population. So that's misconception number one, we'll say. Another misconception would be that same-sex individuals, now that you can live openly and without persecution, that means that you're not going to procreate biologically. I know lots of gay couples, both women and men, that do have children. Some of them have them by a previous heterosexual marriage. Some of them go through either surrogacy or artificial insemination. The queers out there are reproducing just fine. And in fact, actually, as heterosexual birth rates are falling, actually the reproduction of the queers are helping to boost numbers. So that's another misconception. And I would say it goes further than that. Even historically, if you look at the repression of queer sexuality, that's fairly recent. If you go back for a few hundred years, you see pretty rampant repression of homosexuality in the West. But if you go back further than that, it doesn't seem to have bothered anyone at all. And so even among the ancients, but definitely foraging societies, hunter-gatherers, they were not so bothered by things like homosexuality and diverse gender expression. So the idea, so and so if the argument is now that it's not repressed, it'll disappear. Well, then why didn't it disappear for the millions of years before it was repressed? In fact, the repression of queerness is really just a small section of our recent history. So it doesn't follow logically that just because they're free to be themselves and not have to fake heterosexuality, it doesn't mean that it's going to be bred out of the population. In fact, I would argue that there's no reason to think it would be.
Good. I want to make it clear that as you are not arguing that the biology of sex throughout the animal kingdom is the only proper scientific guide for sexual behavior. You certainly recognize that you can't derive aught from is, but is important to know, and culture, morality, tradition are even may not be strictly scientific in the same sense that they shouldn't be influence our behaviors, because certainly they would. I mean, the willful killing in the animal world, the law of the jungle, kill or be killed, the various types of sexual pedophilia, sex between adults and juveniles, or forced sex, rape. Obviously, all those are wrong. So here's my question. I mean, you're very clear about that, but here's my question. How do you pick and choose? I mean, what is the argument that says we should look at the sexual diversity in the animal kingdom as an important data point to understand the proper range of what we consider normal in humans, and use the animal models to help support that, but then you're not choosing all the other kinds of things which you radically reject. In other
Right.
words, how do you make that choice? It can sound like cherry picking.
Mhm. Except that I would argue we never used what animals do as a way to define right and wrong in any other way. When we decide to prohibit murder or theft or, even antitrust legislation, nobody's looking to the animal world on
Right.
those. So why would we do it with the sexual realm. But that's exactly what the other side did, right? Is they said it's unnatural. And that was part of why they felt justified in outlawing, for example, homosexuality. Because if you have two consenting adults that are clearly not hurting anyone, your usual ways of outlawing a behavior wouldn't apply because it was based only on moral disapproval, because they weren't hitting anyone, they weren't stealing, they weren't, it was just confined to each other if they had a relationship. So to justify the outlawing of this behavior, they went to the natural world and they saw a lot of biased research that that would have excluded same-sex behavior, and that's what my book is really trying to undo. And so what I'm arguing for in looking at the natural world is a correction of what has been argued before, which is that it's unnatural or aberrant or has no place, and there's something must have gone wrong. And in fact, if you look at the research on human sexuality, from the 1950s where it got its start all the way up through the 90s, it reads as if people are trying to study what went wrong. Why are these people gay? This seems weird and it needs an explanation. So my argument is just simply that it's natural, not that it's right, wrong, or anything else. If you're going to outlaw homosexuality, for example, then it's on you to argue why. Why do you feel justified when there's no victim? It's you have consensual adults doing what they do. So the argument was, oh, well, it's unnatural and it's wrong and therefore bad for society. Okay, well, if it's not unnatural, what do you got left? So that's why I'm not arguing that we look at animals and say they do it, so it's fine. I'm never saying that. I'm pushing back against others taking the opposite argument.
Nathan, you used the term promiscuous in describing the animal sexuality, which initially sounds a little odd when we're thinking about applying it to animals, but it's certainly legitimate. And the vast majority of animal sexuality is what we would call promiscuous if that were occurring among humans. So that is entirely right. And what would be called monogamy, which some people use in some isolated animals, a very, very small percentage of what's happening in the animal world, the non-human animal world. So is that a problem for your overall thesis?
How these words are used differently, as you mentioned. So promiscuity in humans, first of all, it tends to come with some moral baggage. It's used as a pejorative. People who are having sex, pardon me, people who are having sex when they shouldn't and with whom they shouldn't. And that's not really what I'm talking about. Animals species have mating systems, and monogamy is one of those mating systems, which is the tendency to form dyads, right? So two individuals bond together and they build a life together, either for a breeding season or for however long. Promiscuity is just the animals that don't do that. That they might bond with others in a group, but they don't have this one-to-one sexual bonding that happens. And that's in difference. So you have monogamy, you also have polygyny and polyandry, where you can have one male bonded to several females or vice versa. And that bonding is somewhat exclusive socially, but it's not necessarily exclusive sexually. Okay, so two animals that form a dyad, like take two muskrats, they're monogamous for a breeding season. They're monogamous not because they don't have sex with anyone else. They're monogamous because they spend all their time working together, pretty much. And they share resources, they share a territory, they defend that territory, they raise offspring together, they'll feed each other, they'll feed their mutual offspring until the offspring is off on their own. And so monogamy is a very common strategy, but it's not the only strategy. In animals, only about 15% of mammals form dyads, these monogamous dyads. Only about 15%, which means 85% do something else, which is polygyny, polyandry, or promiscuity would be the most common ones. But if you look at birds, at least in migratory birds, 90% of them are monogamous. About half of those are only seasonally monogamous, so they sort of get divorced at the end of the year. But the other half can go on for several breeding seasons. Now, the ones that are not monogamous among birds, a lot of times are the interesting ones. So they're the ones that often will live in certain colonies and flocks that are stable, so they don't necessarily migrate throughout the year. What the theme of all this, the theme of all this is that the mating system that birds and mammals use fits their ecology, either their environmental ecology or their social ecology. In other words, they do what works best for them in the environment in which they live. A lot of times, polygynous species, the males do a lot of male-male contest competition. What's the purpose of that? To keep the gene pool as strong as it can be by eliminating, genes that make individuals poorly adapted.
Good, Nathan. That's again critical information that's needed to understand the richness of sexuality. So what I'd like to do now is talk about the so-called biological basis of homosexuality. And through many decades, which I followed, my doctorates in neuroscience, so biology was an area I followed, there seemed to be an effort to show that homosexuality was natural because there was some biological basis for it, that it was nature, that there was a gay gene, or there was certain kind of hormones, or as you point out in the book, different structure of the preoptic area in the brain, or some very specific scientific reason why homosexuality would occur, which the argument was gave it legitimacy of a kind of normality because it was biologically based. It wasn't because your mother spent too much time with you, or whatever the social simplicit reasons are. Now you call all of this misguided. You say the whole question of the biological basis of homosexuality is not only misguided, but you say even ironically the lack of the strong conclusions from each of these areas is very informative in itself. So how does all that fit together?
Right. So those who were searching for a biological basis for homosexuality, as you mentioned, were reacting against those who thought it had purely social, origin. So a lot of one of the myths that was out there for a while is that if a child is sexually abused, they're more likely to become gay, and that's homosexuals are really victims of sexual assault more than they are, sort of a natural occurrence. And so the idea that a biological basis was thought to be by progressives would at least get rid of some of that. Oh, it wasn't just a doting mother or a distant father, or the idea that it was a distant father is the most ridiculous thing ever, because children of single mothers are no more likely to become gay. If there was a distant father, you don't get more distant than being absent. And yet not all those kids are gay, or even a higher proportion. So we knew it wasn't just simply family structures. And even twin studies have shown that, where, twins who are raised in different households, their sexuality corresponds very frequently, but not always. And I think it's really interesting that even identical twins raised in the same home, because if you're an identical twin, you start off with mostly the same genetics, even the same uterine environment. And then if you're raised in the same home, the fact that there would be different sexualities there shocked everyone, but they're not perfectly correlated. You can have one gay and one straight, or any other permutation thereof. And so the reason why I call it misguided, even though it was attempting to put legitimacy, as you said, to the idea of alternative sexualities. The reason I say it was misguided is it was really trying to isolate a variable as if it were eye color, or something that was simple with a couple of genes, maybe. But we now know that your sexual attractions, there is not a single gay gene. It's spread all throughout your genome. Anything that's related to, how you interact with other people, and how you find your gender, for example, fitting in with the society, that can affect your attractions. I give a good parallel of this is height. There are thousands of genes that affect how tall you are, and most of them are not things that you would think are obvious. They're things like hormone receptors and things that aren't in any way connected to bones. But metabolism and growth rates and things like this. And the same is going to be true for sexuality. It affects all kinds of our psychology, and so therefore it springs forth from all kinds of our biology.
You make a great distinction in the book, in the sense that you say that homosexuality is not genetic in the way that having green eyes is genetic, a couple of genes that make your eyes green. But it is genetic in the way that having kidneys is genetic because having kidneys involves thousands of genes and all millions of cells in all different ways.
I think that's a good analogy for it. It is genetic in the sense that your genes play a role, but it's not genetic in the sense that there's a gene for it, right? It will be the contribution of many, many, many genes. There's no one gene for having a kidney or for running fast or for being smart, right? It's the interplay of many, 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 many genes all throughout the chromosome. So we couldn't isolate this even if we wanted to. That said, some really interesting things have been found in the pursuit of the gay gene. And one of them is that, at least for men, the more homosexual you are, the more same sex driven you are, you tend to have very fertile female relatives. And this was discovered multiple times in multiple groups that there seems to be some connection between female fertility and male homosexuality on the X chromosome. We still don't have a good idea of what that could be. A couple of good hypotheses are out there, but they're not holding up. So I don't want to say much because, a few years from now, we won't, we will have moved on. But there seems to be some connection with fertility, female fertility specifically, and male homosexuality.
Right.
Whereas with female homosexuality, it tends to correlate more with exposure to androgens in utero, which is again something that's not easy to measure in humans. But that kind of variability, why would nature do that? Well, the answer is nature is always producing variability in all of our other features. Think of height, weight, skin tone, body hair distribution, eye color. Think of all of the other traits that we know we vary on because nature is always producing that variability. Why wouldn't gender and sexuality be subject to that same process of diversity and variation? And then you throw all that's nature's way is you throw all this variation out into the environment, and whatever works will thrive, and whatever doesn't work will disappear.
You also use the analogy of left-handedness. I'm not sure what the lefties are in the population, but I would guess around 10%, which seems similar to homosexuality.
Yeah, so left-handedness takes shape very, very early on. It seems to be in utero as well. And for a long time, it was suppressed. You were not allowed to be left-handed. When you were
Right.
in school, they would smack your hand if you grabbed something with the left, and they made you write with the right hand and throw with the right hand. And what that all it found is it made things very hard for, about 8%, 6 to 8% of the population really struggled because it wasn't their dominant hand. And you can't just make it become your dominant hand. Once we relaxed everything and just created a couple of simple accommodations, left-handed desks, left-handed scissors, a few other things, it found its natural prevalence. It's about 8% of the population is left-handed. I would say that the similar things with diverse gender expression and sexuality is once we take the repression off, it will find some kind of natural prevalence. However, unlike left-handedness, I believe that the environment, the social environment, has a role to play in this too. So what you're exposed to as a child does affect your attractions later in life. And we know this because people tend to be attracted to their same, biogeographical ethnic group. If you're surrounded by, people that sort of look a certain way, you develop attractions like that. So we know that taboos can help suppress attractions a little bit, not completely, but they can affect their development. So I think that the nature nurture debate was always wrong. It's nature and nurture. There's genetic elements to it. There's uterine environment that plays a role. And then, of course, there's the social environment in which your attractions take shape.
Much appreciate. I have to ask you this. It relates to animals and sex and humans. It's a joke that I've heard a long time ago, which seems very probative, and I'm not sure it is. And so the joke goes something like this, or the comparison of humans and non-human animals are the following: that non-human animals eat in private because they don't want to have their food stolen, and they have sex in public because they don't care. Whereas humans eat in public and have sex in private. Is there any significance in that?
I'm not so sure about the eating in public versus private because there's lots of animals that actually do have, communal eating, and it is a social event for them. But the idea that humans are really kind of unique for having sexual congress in private, that's true. And we don't fully understand why that is. But one thing I'll note is that not all cultures are extremely private with their sexual activity. There's varying degrees to this, but you do find exceptions. But as a general trend, we do tend to be private with sexual congress. And a lot of people tie this back to the earliest social structures of humans and the creation of the human family and human dyads with what we call obscured paternity. So you don't always know, who the father of a child is if the woman has had sex with multiple males.
Hmm.
So mate guarding is one way that males do to try to protect their paternal investment. And mate guarding, it basically is a function of jealousy, the idea that you don't want your partner to be with anyone else. Well, the idea of taking that to an extreme to where you're secluded during the sexual act, that could have been where that came from. And that was a way to sort of guarantee your paternity, is to just kind of disappear for a while, even if it was just for an evening or whatever. I don't, the thing is, again, you're going to find, like in the Cook Islands, you're going to find some indigenous groups that don't have the same taboos about some of this stuff. So it kind of falls apart when you realize that we don't really know what the natural state might be for us if we hadn't been conditioned by these taboos.
Fascinating stuff. Nathan, what I want to do now is go through what you call four misconceptions from your book, The Sexual Evolution. And let's be very brief on each one, just each myth, each misconception that most people have. Number one, homosexuality is genetic.
There's a genetic element to it. It's genetically influenced, but there's no gay gene. It's not even a small cluster of genes. It's a little bit everywhere. And so gay people pop up in all the family trees. It's diffusely genetic.
Misconception number two, homosexuality harms biological fitness.
No, from everything we can tell, queer people reproduce at similar rates to straight people.
Misconception number three, homosexuality was oppressed for most of human history.
No, it seems to be a fairly recent social convention in the West that really dates back mostly to the Middle Ages. Before that, there wasn't active suppression, not among the ancients, and certainly not in prehistorical societies.
And we know in ancient Greece and Rome, there were various expressions that had different social connotations.
Yes, in Egypt and Sumer and all of them.
Misconception number four, heterosexuals are purely heterosexual.
Yeah, I think this began with the Kinsey report in the 1950s. Um, Alfred Kinsey even found that even in that very repressed society in the 1950s, is that even among males, which are more staunchly heterosexual, the idea that they've had some curiosity and have reacted sexually. Kinsey found that about a third of the male population reacted sexually to another male at least, one or two times in their life. And so you don't have we do have, like, the collection of people who are more sort of solidly homosexual, solidly heterosexual, but that fluidity does exist, and your attractions are much more open than we realize that they are. I'm not saying that everybody's bisexual. I'm just saying that we're all probably a lot more open and curious, especially if we had been raised without the taboos. We would be much more open and curious, and it wouldn't have been something that frightened us so much.
And your overall conclusion is that the most notable feature of the human sexual experience is diversity.
Diversity. Diversity wins always. That doesn't challenge anyone, who thinks they're very sure, I'm cisgender, I'm straight, I've always been this way. That's perfectly fine. No one's challenging that. I just hope that maybe you'll have more understanding towards your neighbors who might feel differently.
Now, even though you give your firm conclusion, and the book is very strong in that respect, you also say, I noticed this, maybe right near the end, speaking personally, you put it in the book, so I'm not embarrassed to ask you personally. You say, I haven't fully worked out all of this for myself,
Hmm.
much less what I think everyone else should do. So, to kind of flesh that out a bit. What haven't you worked out?
Well, I don't have any grand prescriptions for society. I really don't. I don't even have that much advice to individuals other than to keep an open mind about yourself and about others, and to not to not find yourself too boxed in by these rigid constructions. Whether that leads us to an absolute total free-for-all of everything and doing away with marriage and all this, that none of that's what I'm saying. And I haven't really worked out how it should affect the institution of marriage. You have individuals, more and more people are abandoning sexual monogamy towards what they call consensual non-monogamy. I don't know what that would look like if all the couples everywhere just sort of abandoned the idea of sexual fidelity. I don't know what would happen. I have a, you know, I understand that even though a lot of our social constructions are artificial, we have constructed them and we lived within them. And so to completely abandon everything that we have built would be disorienting to say the least. So I haven't worked out what anyone can or should do. I'm not out there saying, oh, do away with monogamy, do away with marriage, or everybody's a little gay. I'm not saying anything like that. I'm just saying that if diversity and creativity are the theme of nature, we should be more open to that idea among our own species because we've seen it pop up over and over again, all throughout all cultures and throughout history. Maybe it is natural. And what we do with that is add that to the list of many other things that we as a society will decide together.
Looking at the future of sexuality, can what you have studied with animal models offer any advice on AI related sexuality, relationships, all different manners of sex? As we know, each new technology, sex is a major driver, and AI, we may find the same thing with AI.
Yeah, I mean, how soon after the internet was born did it become dominated by pornography, right? So it's only a matter of time before artificial intelligence will affect our sex lives, and I think it already has, right? Because if you are seeking either pornography or other sexual experiences online, you will be directed based on the algorithms that you're using to search. So it's already there, but people have already talked about having more virtual reality in terms of pornography moving more in that virtual reality realm and having a multi-sensory experience that is really just an individual and a computer. I To me, it doesn't hold a lot of interest. I'm not someone who's going to be seeking that out because I think a key part of sex is the interrelational connection and the emotional connection. And until a computer can really at least make us think it has an emotional experience with us, I don't think it's going to ever really take over. However, that said, there's lots of consumption of sexual material in the form of pornography and so forth that will be, I think, affected by AI, and AI will deliver that product to us. And you've already seen, I mean, probably you have Instagram pages that are AI generated art, right? Well, there's AI generated sexy Instagram accounts, of individuals who are not real people, but who are models of various body types and things like that. And you're seeing individuals, couples, and of course, this will go into videos. And so, artificially generated pornography, I think, is probably going to be the near term frontier. Where it takes us beyond, are we going to be like in, I think that movie is Demolition Man, where two people have sex by just putting items on their heads like a helmet, and they don't actually exchange body fluids. I don't think we'll head there anytime soon, but who knows?
I like what you said earlier about having an open mind is the hallmark of your book Towards Sexuality. Having an open mind is indeed the underlying theme of Closer to Truth. So we're very much aligned on that, and very much appreciate all your analysis.
Yes, and I've been a big fan of the show for a very long time, and I think that having an open mind applies to learning, but it also applies to how we relate to one another. And I think that it expands far beyond gender and sex, of course, to be open to one another experience as valid. But we live in such politically charged times now that a lot of people, because of their politics, has led them to a certain opinion on gender and sexuality that they might not have had otherwise. I mean, in this country, if you tell me what you think about guns, I'll tell you what you think about transgender individuals. It just, those two things have nothing to do with each other, but they're so politically polarizing that we've established camps where groups of beliefs are now all linked together because of politics. I really hope we can get away with that. There is not a political message in my book except this is be nice to each other, be open to each other. That's it. Public policy prescriptions don't, necessarily flow from that in a specific way. So this isn't a book for only progressives. I actually hope conservatives will read my book as well, and just so that they can, be more open to the individuals around them.
Good, Nathan. Really appreciate what we like to do on Closer to Truth when we talk to our friends is ask a series of questions which are really not designed for thoughtful answers, but for quick answers. We call it short answers to very big questions. So the questions are much bigger, but the answers have to be much shorter. So we ask you to indulge us with that incongruity. So I'm just going to ask you a few questions. Give your first reaction. So the first one, which we have discussed in various ways, but I want to now put some numbers on it, is nature versus nurture in sexuality and gender. You can distinguish between the two if you like. So if you just have a simple dyadic scale between nature and nurture, which is unfair maybe, but that's what I like to do, between 0 and 100, nature and nurture for sexuality, and then for gender.
50-50, 50-50. I think
So
I
that's
think
interesting. So I would have thought gender would have a higher percentage of nurture rather than sexuality.
No, I think that the biological basis of gender and the biological basis of sexuality sort of are similar, and have similar themes. And I think that the expression of either of those really comes about because of the environment. So I think you have a template, a chassis, and sometimes called a norm of reaction, like a range of possible outcomes that the genetics determines, but then it takes shape in the environment. So it's a huge range set by the genes, and then its precise manifestation comes about by interaction with the social environment.
And it would be similar for both sexuality and gender.
I think they are similar, yeah, and I think they go together. Not that one is dependent on the other, but they form part of our unified gendered experience in life. So I think they go. I think they do kind of go together.
Okay. Of sexually active people today in the US, what percentage would you say engage regularly in any kind of non-heterosexual behaviors that involve, let's say, let's exclude masturbation from that?
Okay. The numbers on this would it vary, depends on how you ask the question, but I would say between 10 and 20%.
Okay. What is your current favorite scientific question that you would most like to see answered in your lifetime?
Where does consciousness come from?
Ah, you got to stay tuned to Closer to Truth.
I do.
Okay, last question. Assuming evolution is which you've studied very intently, is a universal principle, and assuming that single cell life emerges in the universe in different places, what is the likely development of intelligent life from that single cell life from a scale of 0 to 100?
Um, I would say it's a very unlikely event. So let me understand the question. You mean assuming we've got single-celled life, what are the
Yeah,
odds that it would go all the way to a civilization
right.
building intelligent life? Less than
Right.
1%. Less than 1%. I would
Okay.
say less than 0.01%. That doesn't
Okay.
mean that there isn't intelligent life out there, but I think it's very few and far between. Because if you look at the history of our species, going all the way back through our ancestry, incredibly unlikely events, often took hundreds of millions of years, and it had to take place in the right place at the right time. Look at how close we came to extinction various times in our
Sure.
past. I think we are the most improbable species, so I don't think you're going to find a universe or a galaxy teeming with civilizations.
Many thanks, Nathan. I thoroughly enjoyed the book, The Sexual Evolution. I've loved our conversation. Viewers can watch TV episodes and dozens of videos on philosophy of biology, including more with Nathan, and including on sexuality on the Closer to Truth website and the Closer to Truth YouTube channel. We appreciate all our viewers. We give you the opportunity, if it suits you, to donate and support Closer to Truth so we can continue to expand our content and our geographical reach. Thanks, everyone, for watching. Nathan, a pleasure.
My pleasure. Thanks so much.
Thank you for watching. If you like this video, please like and comment below. You can support Closer to Truth by subscribing. Closer to Truth is now accepting your tax-exempt donations. Please come to closertotruth.com/donate. Thank you very much for supporting us, and thanks for watching.